They say peace is priceless, until someone tries to put a price on your land. For Caleb Dawson, peace looked like early mornings drenched in golden sunlight, the steady rhythm of cowbells, and the familiar crow of a rooster echoing over rolling fields. His farm, a rugged stretch of earth etched with history and sweat, had been in the Mitchell family for nearly a century. To outsiders, it was just land. To Jake, it was a living memory, a tribute to those who came before him, and a quiet rebellion against the modern world's obsession with speed and control. He didn't need much to be happy. Just the scent of tilled soil in the morning, the feel of dirt under his boots, and the kind of silence only the countryside could offer. Out there, the world made sense. Seeds grew when you cared for them. Animals trusted you if you earned it, and time moved at the pace of the sun, not the ticking of a wall clock. He'd never had a boss barking orders, or a neighbor whining about fence lines. His only rule? Live and let live. That philosophy had served him just fine, until a woman named Karen Whitmore showed up and decided his way of life didn't fit into her picture of perfection. Crestwood Estates was the kind of suburban development that sprang up like a weed, expensive, artificially perfect, and just close enough to the countryside to borrow its charm without respecting it. It had shiny cul-de-sacs, chemically green lawns, and rows of identical homes that looked like they'd been stamped out of a catalogue. About 5 years ago, the subdivision had popped up next to Jake's farm like an unwanted appendage. He'd watched the houses go up, one by one, wondering how long it would take before someone started complaining about the smell of manure or the sound of nature doing what nature does. But he hadn't expected a full-blown crusade. Not until Karen. The first time she marched up his gravel driveway, Jake was sitting on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the morning mist lift off the fields. He could tell from a mile away she was trouble. Tall, stiff, and overdressed for a farm visit, Karen wore a beige pantsuit, so aggressively pressed, it looked like it had never encountered real wind. Her heels clicked against the wooden steps like a warning bell, and she clutched a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. Jake didn't stand up. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back, took a long sip, and waited. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clipped and tight, like she was holding back the urge to sanitize the porch before sitting on it. Jake gave her a nod, calm as a pond. "That's me. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association." She said it like it meant something, like it gave her jurisdiction over the soil beneath his boots. "I wanted to have a quick word about your property." Jake raised an eyebrow. Not hostile, just curious. "Didn't know I had anything to do with Crestwood Estates." Karen's smile tightened, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Technically, no. But your farm is adjacent to our community, and as I'm sure you can understand, property values are a delicate matter." Jake set his mug down. This was going to be good. "We've received several complaints," she continued, flipping her clipboard to a list that was probably more dramatic than factual, "about noise, odors, the visual impact of your structures. We have a certain aesthetic we maintain, and unfortunately, your farm stands out in ways that are less than ideal." Jake chuckled under his breath. "Less than ideal," he repeated. "Lady, that barn has been red since Eisenhower was in office." She didn't flinch. "That red is quite jarring against the neutral palette of Crestwood Estates. Perhaps repainting it in something less aggressive would help, or downsizing entirely." "And the rooster?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Several residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise. It's quite disruptive." Jake looked out across his fields, then back at her. "So you want me to repaint my barn and tell a rooster to sleep in?" Karen gave a patient sigh, the kind that said she believed she was dealing with a child. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand change can be difficult, but this really is in everyone's best interest. We'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue. Jake stood up, stretched slowly, and looked her straight in the eyes. Miss Whitmore, my farm isn't part of your HOA. Your rules don't apply here. My barn isn't hurting anyone, and neither are my animals. I appreciate you stopping by, but you're wasting your time. Her lips tightened into a hard line. We'll see about that, she snapped, spinning on her heel and stalking back to her SUV, like she owned the gravel it was parked on. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He'd seen bulls with more subtlety. Something told him this woman wasn't used to being told no. He'd dealt with coyotes, droughts, and ornery mules. But Karen Whitmore, that was going to be a whole different kind of problem. Jake figured that would be the last he'd hear from her. A woman like that, high heels, high ego, surely had better things to do than pick fights with a farmer who'd done nothing more than mind his own business. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. Within 2 days, a formal-looking letter arrived in his mailbox. The envelope was stamped with the HOA's emblem, the kind of thing designed to look official, even if it carried no real weight. Inside, it was filled with vague legal jargon and empty threats. Failure to comply with neighborhood aesthetic standards, visual disruption of community harmony, odorous interference with daily residential enjoyment. Jake read it twice, then burst out laughing. Odorous interference? That's what she was calling the scent of fresh hay and barn animals? To him, that was the smell of hard work and clean living. But to Karen, it might as well have been chemical warfare. He pinned the letter to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow and went about his day, thinking that surely this was the end of it. It wasn't. By the end of the week, the trickle turned into a flood. More letters arrived, each one more ridiculous than the last. One accused him of unauthorized poultry. Another insisted that his gravel driveway was an unregulated ingress point. The language was so convoluted it could have passed for satire. But Jake knew better. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a woman with too much time on her hands. This was personal. And Karen wasn't going to stop until she either got her way or hit a wall she couldn't bulldoze. Then came the complaints to the county. Someone, who could it be, had filed multiple reports citing code violations. First, a zoning inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, and apology in his eyes. The man admitted he had to investigate a possible non-compliant land use. Jake took him on a tour of the farm, pointing out the zoning certificate nailed to the barn wall and every regulation they were supposedly breaking, which, of course, was none. The inspector nodded, jotted down a few notes out of obligation, and left with a muttered, "This is a waste of time." But the parade didn't stop. The very next day, it was the health department. A woman named Cheryl came out, claiming someone had reported unsanitary animal conditions. She was professional but clearly irritated, less by Jake than by having to waste her day chasing phantom problems. She inspected the livestock pens, the chicken coop, even sniffed at the compost pile like she was on a cooking show gone wrong. "Cleanest place I've seen all month," she muttered, shaking her head. Jake offered her a dozen eggs and sent her off with a polite wave. The following morning, it was animal welfare, and then fire safety, and even, just for flavor, the environmental board. Each one walked in with a clipboard and a wary expression, and each one left shaking their heads, realizing they'd been dragged into some ridiculous vendetta orchestrated by a woman with too much power and not enough sense. It wasn't until Roger showed up that Jake got the full story. Roger, an old-school health inspector nearing retirement, wasn't afraid to speak his mind. After doing a quick sweep of Jake's immaculately kept barn, he sighed and leaned against the fence. "Son, I don't know who you upset, but they've got our office running in circles. Karen Whitmore's name is on every one of these complaints. Off the record, of course." Jake offered him a glass of iced tea, and they stood there for a while, watching the goats nibble at the grass. Roger shook his head. You've got a real piece of work on your hands. Jake chuckled. You have no idea. What came next wasn't funny, though, because after the officials left, the notes began showing up. Handwritten, unsigned, stuffed into his mailbox, or taped to the edge of his property line. One read, "Your farm smell is ruining our property values. Be considerate." Another said, "Children are disturbed by the sight of your animals. Please shield them from view." The most absurd one yet. "A maintained lawn is a sign of respect. Mow your fields or expect consequences." They were dripping with passive aggression, each one more absurd than the last, but Jake knew exactly who was behind them. The same handwriting, the same tone. Karen was trying to bury him under a mountain of paper, hoping he'd just give up and fold. He didn't. Jake had been through droughts that cracked the earth like old leather, winters so cold his breath turned to crystals, and wild animals that saw his livestock as a buffet. A few letters and a bitter suburban tyrant weren't going to break him, but even he wasn't prepared for what happened next. One hot afternoon, while Jake was hammering fresh nails into a section of fence damaged in the last storm, he heard it. A loud mechanical whine. The growl of a chainsaw cutting into wood. Not from his side of the property, but right near the boundary line. He stood up, sweat trickling down his neck, and peered toward the edge of the field. That's when he saw them. A team of workers in reflective vests was driving posts into the ground, on his land, not near it, not beside it, on it. And they weren't just installing a fence. They were putting up a steel wall, tall and industrial, meant to hide his farm from view entirely. And standing behind them, arms crossed and face smug with satisfaction, was Karen Whitmore herself. Clipboard in hand, again. Jake's boots hit the ground hard as he stormed across the field, rage building with every step. He reached the site and barked loud enough for the chainsaw to die in its tracks. "What in the blue hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned with a look of mock innocence that would have been comical if it wasn't infuriating. "Mr. Mitchell," she cooed, "we're simply installing a visual barrier to help protect the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood." Jake pointed to the fence posts. "You're on my land." Her expression didn't change. "Well, that's debatable. Our community reviewed some older maps, and it appears the property line may have been drawn incorrectly. Until we get clarification, we've decided to move forward with the improvement project." Jake took a slow, deliberate step toward the workers. "You boys got a permit?" One of them glanced nervously at Karen before muttering, HOA told us they had all the paperwork." Jake smirked, but there was no humor in it. "They don't. And if you're still here in 5 minutes, I'll be calling the sheriff, and you'll all be cited for trespassing on my land." The workers looked at each other, then back at Karen. She opened her mouth to protest, but one of them had already started packing up. The chainsaw was shut down, the materials loaded up, and within minutes the site was deserted. Karen left fuming in the dust cloud of her defeated army. "You can't just stop a community improvement project," she snapped. Jake pulled out his phone and held it up. "Let's make it official. I'll call the county right now. We'll get the surveyors out here, and we'll see exactly who's standing on whose land." Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked rattled. "There's no need for that." "Then I suggest you walk away, Miss Whitmore," Jake said, voice steady, low, and as unmovable as the barn behind him. "Because next time, I'm not asking." She stood there for a moment, nostrils flaring, fingers gripping her clipboard like it was a weapon. But eventually she turned, heels stabbing into the dirt as she marched back to her luxury SUV. Jake watched her go, eyes narrowed, fists unclenching only once she was out of sight. The moment she was gone, he walked straight into his house, dug through a drawer, and pulled out the property deed. Then he found the official county surveyor map, made copies, and got them notarized. He wasn't waiting for Karen to try something again. He was going to be ready. Because if she wanted a war, he'd show her what fighting looked like when a man had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Jake thought the stunt with the fence would be the peak of Karen's madness, but he had clearly underestimated the depth she was willing to sink to. About a week after the aborted construction, Jake stepped outside one morning, coffee in hand, to check on the livestock and enjoy the early light rolling over the hills. That's when he saw it. Just off the edge of the road that bordered his property, smack in the middle of his eastern field, stood a massive for sale sign, glossy, professional, and arrogantly planted into his soil like a flag claiming new territory. Underneath the bold letters was a second placard that read, "Under negotiation, coming soon, Crestwood Estates, Phase 2. For a few seconds, Jake just stood there, blinking, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the sign was real. Someone had crossed the boundary, drilled metal posts into his land, and announced to the world that his farm was now up for grabs. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. He stormed over, yanked the sign out of the ground with one furious pull, and hauled it back toward the porch like a trophy captured in battle. Before he even had a chance to call the HOA office, a silver SUV came rolling up the drive, tires crunching the gravel with a slow, smug rhythm. And out stepped Karen Whitmore, dressed like she was headed to a corporate boardroom instead of a rural dispute, smile painted on like a second skin. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell," she chirped, as if nothing unusual had happened. "I see you found the sign. Bit of a mix-up, I'm sure. Some of the realtors got ahead of themselves." Jake didn't bother pretending to be polite. He folded his arms, eyes narrowed. "Tell me, Karen, are you claiming that a real estate company accidentally listed my land without ever contacting me, walking it, or even confirming ownership? Or are you just hoping I'll be too dumb to notice when you try to steal it right out from under me?" Her smile twitched, but she held onto it like a lifeline. "There's been interest in expanding Crestwood, and a few of our agents assumed your farm might be available. A simple misunderstanding, that's all." Jake didn't blink. "You're insane if you think you can claim my property and play innocent when I catch you." Karen sighed, like he was the one being unreasonable. "We're just trying to make the community better, cohesive, unified." He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put up this sign and tell them to stay the hell off my land. Because if I see another one, I'm not just pulling it down. I'll be suing your entire HOA for fraud, illegal advertisement, and trespassing." She tried to protest, but Jake was already turning to go. He'd had enough. Enough of the games, the lies, the ridiculous theater. This wasn't just about one person being a nuisance anymore. It was about power. About someone trying to bully and manipulate their way into ownership over something they had no right to. Jake had faced down storms that tore roofs off barns and winters that froze pipes solid. But this was something else. A storm with lipstick and legal jargon. And Jake, he wasn't about to let it win. If Karen wanted a war, then Jake decided it was time to start fighting back the only way a stubborn, country-bred man knew how, by turning her complaints into comedy and using the law like a pitchfork. The first thing he did was visit the county clerk's office and request every zoning map, land deed, and recorded boundary line related to his property. Then he had them scanned, copied, certified, and placed in a bright red binder that he left sitting right by his front door. Next, he paid a visit to Sheriff Tom Caldwell, a childhood friend and someone who still owed him a few favors from their school days. Jake explained the whole saga in patient detail, from the letters to the inspector visits to the latest fake sale sign. Tom listened, eyebrows climbing higher with each passing moment, until he finally exhaled and said, You're telling me she tried to sell your farm without even asking you first? Jake nodded. Tom shook his head. Hell, Jake, that's bold even for her. Jake grinned. I figured I'd better start keeping score. Tom leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles. You just let me know if she steps foot on your land again. We'll handle it. With legal backup secured and county documents in hand, Jake turned to the one thing he knew would really get under Karen's skin. Doing everything she hated, completely within the bounds of the law. Karen hated noise. Fine. Jake invested in 3 new roosters and built them a larger, elevated coop that helped project their crowing across the entire eastern ridge. Every morning at 5 sharp, their caws rang out like alarm clocks with no snooze button. Karen hated the sight of his fields. Great. Jake planted a thick row of towering sunflowers along the property line, the kind that grew tall and wild, shielding her view while turning her neat neighborhood backdrop into a country canvas bursting with yellow. But the real punch came when Jake teamed up with his old buddy Mason, who ran the local farmers market. They launched a brand new event, Farmer Fun Day, hosted every Saturday on Jake's land. It was legal, festive, and noisy as hell. Flyers went out across town. People came from all over, families with kids in tow, local musicians looking for a stage, vendors eager to sell honey, jam, and artisan cheese. There were pony rides, a petting zoo, and enough foot traffic to clog up the small county road that bordered Crestwood Estates. Jake set up hay bale seating and a rustic wooden stage for live music. The smell of barbecue wafted over the fields, mingling with laughter and the sound of fiddles playing into the afternoon breeze. It was everything Karen despised. Spontaneous, rural, joyful, and completely out of her control. And predictably, she showed up. Karen came stomping across the field mid-event, heels sinking into the grass, face flushed with rage, clipboard in hand like a weapon of mass delusion. She marched straight up to Jake, dodging a toddler carrying a goat, and snapped, "This is completely unacceptable. You can't turn your farm into a public amusement park." Jake crossed his arms, grin wide. "But I can, Karen. See, I checked. My land's zoned for agritourism. Every permit's been approved, every parking space measured. You're welcome to browse the produce tent if you're feeling adventurous." Her jaw clenched so hard, Jake half expected her teeth to shatter. The noise, the traffic, the parking, it's disrupting the neighborhood. "Not my neighborhood," Jake said, his voice smooth as molasses. "And as long as folks keep coming, I reckon it'll be a weekly event." Karen looked like she might combust on the spot, but with a field full of witnesses, there wasn't a damn thing she could do. Jake watched her storm off again, her fury trailing behind her like exhaust fumes, and took a long, satisfied sip of lemonade. He knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. People like Karen didn't accept defeat. They plotted. But Jake was ready. He'd turned the tables, and now she was the one reacting, the one fuming, the one losing her grip. And as the sun dipped low over the hills, and the last notes of fiddle music danced across the sky, Jake felt something he hadn't in weeks. Peace. Real peace. The kind you earn after standing your ground and refusing to be pushed. But the next chapter in this war, it was coming fast. Because Karen wasn't done, and neither was Jake. For most people, the idea of facing public embarrassment once is enough to bring some sense of humility. But Karen Whitmore wasn't most people. After her meltdown at Jake's weekend event, she vanished for a few days. No letters, no threats, no mysterious county visits. Jake knew better than to assume she'd given up. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat with grace. She was the type to retreat, regroup, and come back swinging. And sure enough, she did. One morning, Jake noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked near the edges of his farm, tucked just out of reach, but close enough to feel intrusive. At first, he figured it was curious townfolk, or maybe visitors, who got lost looking for his market. But then he spotted the drone. It buzzed overhead like a mechanical mosquito, swooping low across his field before vanishing behind the tree line. He stood there, hands on his hips, watching its flight path, a slow smile creeping onto his face. This wasn't curiosity. This was surveillance. Karen had apparently hired a private investigator. Jake caught the guy red-handed later that afternoon, crouched near the fence with a camera in hand, trying to stay inconspicuous in a bright orange windbreaker, subtle as a marching band. Jake didn't yell. He didn't charge. He simply walked up, calm as ever, and asked, "You getting paid enough to trespass, or just doing it for the thrill?" The man stammered something about documenting potential code violations for an interested party, but Jake was already done listening. He escorted him off the land, made a call to Sheriff Tom to document the incident, then spent the evening pulling security footage from the last few days. Jake didn't waste a minute. He compiled everything: the letters, the photos, the drone footage, the audio recordings from the market, the signed county permits, and had his lawyer draft a cease and desist order so airtight it might as well have come with a padlock. But Jake wasn't stopping there. He was done being reactive. He was going to confront the heart of the problem head on. The next evening, he walked straight into the Crestwood HOA meeting, uninvited and unannounced. The room fell silent as the door opened, and Caleb Dawson, boots dusty, shoulders broad, binder in hand, stepped inside. Karen was already standing at the front of the room, giving one of her usual power speeches about community integrity and residential consistency. Her face froze mid-sentence. Jake didn't say a word at first. He strode to the front, placed the thick folder of documents down on the long table where the board sat, and looked Karen straight in the eye. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to end this." He spoke clearly, no anger in his voice, just the certainty of a man who had been pushed too far. He explained the harassment, the surveillance, the fraudulent sale signs, and illegal fence attempts. He laid out the list of violations, the unsupported complaints, the impersonated residents, the attempts to manipulate zoning officials using lies and forged complaints. And then he handed over the legal order. "This is your final warning," he said. "Keep off my land, stop interfering with my business, and stop trying to turn your personal grudge into a community mission, or I'll take this to court and sue both the HOA and you personally." Karen's face turned beet red. She sputtered, grasping for words. But before she could launch into one of her tirades, one of the other HOA members, an older woman named Susan who had remained quiet until now, stood up and cleared her throat. "Karen," she said gently but firmly, "maybe it's time we reconsider our approach." Then another board member, Greg, who had once been Karen's biggest cheerleader, chimed in. "This is going to get us all sued. He's not even part of our HOA. We've overstepped." Karen looked around, suddenly realizing her once loyal board was no longer in her corner. Over the next few minutes, the meeting dissolved into open rebellion. Accusations flew. People brought up old fines, unfair warnings, ridiculous rules about mailbox heights and holiday decorations. The mood shifted like a landslide. Richard, the HOA president, who had always played the middle, finally stood up, cleared his throat, and made it official. "We're calling an emergency vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA enforcement head, effective immediately." Karen gasped, stunned, as hands began to rise one after the other. The vote was swift and decisive. Karen didn't leave the meeting with her usual confident strut. She left hunched, red-faced, and visibly shaking. A woman stripped of power and reputation in front of the very people she once ruled like a suburban queen. Jake didn't stick around for the aftermath. He simply nodded to Richard, picked up his binder, and walked out. The war was over, and Jake hadn't just won, He'd buried the enemy without raising his voice or breaking the law. The following week, a for sale sign appeared once again, but this time it was in Karen's yard. Rumor had it she wasn't just selling the house. She was leaving town altogether. Some said she'd been pressured by the rest of the HOA. Others claimed it was her own decision, the shame too much to bear. Jake didn't care either way. She was gone. The storm had passed. And for the first time in months, he could feel the quiet returning. With Karen out of the picture, the entire neighborhood seemed to take a collective breath. The tension that had once clung to Crestwood Estates like fog began to lift. People who had kept their heads down during Karen's reign now came out into the light. Yards once kept under tight, artificial control started to show signs of life and individuality. Colorful flower beds, garden gnomes, porch swings, and kids riding their bikes without fear of being fined for leaving chalk on the sidewalk. The neighborhood began to feel like a community instead of a compound. The HOA sent Jake a formal apology, signed, sealed, and delivered, and he framed it on his wall right next to Karen's infamous cease and desist, a trophy of sorts, a symbol that sometimes the good guy really does win. A few days after the vote, Linda, Susan, Greg, and a few others from the now liberated HOA board stopped by Jake's porch with a basket of baked goods and uneasy smiles. "We figured we owed you an apology," Linda said, handing him a homemade pecan pie. Jake leaned against the railing, eyebrow raised. "Never thought I'd see the day an HOA brought me dessert." They all laughed, nervously at first, but it turned genuine. Ted, a soft-spoken board member who rarely spoke up, finally said, "Honestly, Jake, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We just didn't want to end up on Karen's hit list." Jake nodded slowly, taking a bite of pie. "Understandable. But let's make one thing clear. Nobody tries to annex Mitchell land again." They chuckled, and just like that, the ice cracked. They weren't enemies anymore. They were neighbors. Real ones this time. But life has a funny sense of humor. Word eventually made its way back to Jake that Karen had tried to start fresh in another town, moved into a new HOA-run neighborhood, probably thinking she could claw her way back into a leadership position and pick up where she left off. But karma was already waiting for her. The new HOA had its own enforcer, someone just as power-hungry as Karen, but with sharper claws and no tolerance for competition. Within a month, Karen found herself on the receiving end of every petty rule she used to wield like a sword. Fined for parking too close to the curb. Reported for a lawn half an inch too high. Slammed with citations for leaving her trash can out a few minutes past pickup. And when she tried to assert herself, tried to speak up at a board meeting, she was shut down faster than she could spell compliance. The new HOA president wasn't interested in challenges. Jake got the news from Linda, who relayed it with a smirk and a sip of lemonade. "She's already put that new house up for sale again," she said. "Can't seem to catch a break." Jake chuckled. Poetic. Meanwhile, Dawson Farms thrived. The weekend farmers market turned into a staple event. Locals came from all over to buy fresh produce, listen to music, and pet the goats. Even folks from Crestwood started stopping by. Shoppers who once scowled at his barn now happily bought eggs and jam from the man who had stood his ground. Peace, real peace, had returned. And on the edge of his property, just beyond the gravel road that once carried Karen's SUV, stood a handmade sign that greeted every passerby with proud painted letters. "Welcome to Dawson Farms. No HOA, no Karens, no problem." It became a town landmark. People took pictures next to it. Kids asked who Karen was, and their parents just smiled. Jake didn't bring her up anymore. He didn't need to. Every sunrise, every crow of the rooster, every laugh from the farm told the story better than words ever could. He had won. Not just the battle, not just the war, but the right to live as he pleased, unbothered and unbent. And in the end, that was more satisfying than any court ruling, any pie, or any apology. It was freedom, earned the hard way, but sweeter than ever.